Under Finance Budget Report, Administration will update the Board on fiscal year 2018 budget development. This item provides an opportunity for the Board's information and discussion.
Welcome. Good evening, President Logan, Superintendent Allison, members of the board, Dr. Thompson. I had an introductory paragraph actually ready, but the conversation regarding the calendar actually segues fairly well into my presentation tonight. It's been a pretty quiet 2 weeks since our last board meeting, since nothing's really happening in Topeka. So tonight I thought I'd spend some time looking at our budget planning process just from a slightly different viewpoint. I actually had envisioned using a physical prop, but then I had nightmares about Dr. Willoughby having to chase balls on the floor, so I decided to go the virtual route. So I do want to look at our fiscal year 18 budget planning process. Not knowing what the revenue side of the equation looks like at this point, as we look at our operating expenses, kind of that bare bones operating expense number that we've been talking about, which is the $8.2 million of cost increases, you can see that our fiscal 18 budget planning process, we are currently out of balance, okay? And just as a reminder of what that $8.2 million encompasses, that's last year's, or this current year's, step and track, and then the normal players on the field, which would be utilities, transportation, software, fuel, some insurance. This $8.2 million did not include any fiscal year 18 wage increases, and it did not reflect any possible calendar change. So it was just the basic cost increases to move the budget to a balanced format. What I want to do in a slightly different way than we've presented it before is kind of present it on a balanced scale viewpoint, going back to the first year under the block grant. And the colors actually are meaningful in this presentation. The blue on the revenue side are indicative of expected or ongoing revenues, whether that's general state aid or property taxes under the LOB. Those are kind of our core revenues on the operating side that we would use to pay for expected and ongoing expenses, the red balls on the right side. And ideally, we need to be in balance. We need to have revenues equal expenditures, again, with potentially a little bit of fallout at the end of the year, but that's the budgeting goal. So under that first year in the block grant, when the revenue side was frozen at the 2014-15 level, we had to make operating cut decisions in order to balance the budget that year. And so that's where we got to in the first year of the block grant. As we moved into the 16-17 planning process, again, we're frozen on the revenue side at the 14-15 level, but we have major cost increases anticipated for the 16-17 school year, if you recall, primarily driven by the benefits of $12 million, and then software, utilities, transportation, all the normal players, totaling $22.7 million. And so the board went through, again, a very painful process of cutting expenses out to get back to that balanced budget, which included the calendar change. And so we made those cuts, and we got back to a balanced budget. Frozen revenues, cutting the $22.7 million of expenses to balance the 16-17 budget. At that point, as we approached the end of June, two things happened related to the budget planning process. The first was that we did have an equity decision from the court in which we did get some capital outlay state aid. That was a last-minute decision by the court that impacted our budget. Now, capital outlay has very specific restrictions on what you can spend it, but we did have some flexibility to move expenses out of the general fund into capital outlay, at least on a short-term basis, to potentially cover some ongoing expenditures. And we did end the year with some year-end cash. Now, we typically end the year with year-end cash because there's just those typical budget fallouts. If we don't, we're probably in trouble. So we need to end it with some. Normally what we do with year-end cash, as Ms. Akins indicated, is we take that cash and we do some year-end transfers to textbooks. That's how we save for those major textbook adoptions. And so that's kind of what we would normally see happen, or we're shoring up some of those expenditures where we know we're not going to get aid until October or November. But in this particular budget year, because of the situation on the revenue side of our balance sheet, we decided, we being the board, they were very committed to giving whatever we could to the employees in the form of wages, because that was an extremely important priority that we wanted to put in place. So we took that one-time cash with some flexibility given to us through the additional of capital outlay aid, and we gave a one-time bonus, and we gave steps and tracks. Now, again, the colors here are important because the green would indicate some sort of one-time source of money or a restricted source of money on both sides. The red, again, are ongoing expenses. So you can kind of see where I'm heading here. On the revenue side, we have all our blue, which are the ongoing revenues. We have 2 green sources of additional funds for 16-17. On the right side of our balance, we have one-time expense and we have 1 ongoing expense. So you can see as we get into our budget planning for this next fiscal year, where we don't know at this point what our one-time cash is, we need the capital outlay state aid for capital because we've already moved expenses in there that we have to cover. On the expense side, the one-time bonus goes away, and you can see before we start any other cost estimate process, we're already a little upside down. We're in a budget imbalance because of that step and track. And that's the concern with using one-time cash, is that you are constantly going to be 1 year out of balance go forward. So this just kind of gave a more visual presentation to that concept of when we use one-time cash to do things like wage increases, if the wage isn't a one-time item, if it's an ongoing item, then we're going to have to find the money for that in the next fiscal year. And now, on top of this year's step and track, then we have the normal players, again, utilities, transportation, software, fuel, all of those things. So here is the dilemma we find ourselves in, is that because there are so many uncertainties in Topeka at this point, we don't know what's going to happen on the revenue side. We could go with the nuclear option and cost cut. We could get rid of we could do differences in wages, utilities. We could go through that whole process like we did last year and cut that $8.2 million, assuming our revenues would stay flat and we would be back in balance, and we could do that. But we really feel there is some money due out of Topeka, hopefully this year, that would prevent us from having to do the nuclear option. Ideally, we would get enough state aid to balance the cost increases. So that's the ideal. I think Mr. Rohde had indicated that's what we kind of expect and would like, but maybe we shouldn't hold our breath for it. So then it becomes what risk are we willing to take as we kind of wait this out? What are we going to use to cover those expenses? Our hope is that we get some general state aid. We should end the year, again, with some level of one-time cash because we've had those same kind of fortuitous set of circumstances, great weather, extremely low diesel fuel costs, the inability to hire enough bus drivers to service our buses. So we should end the year with cash. We're just not going to know exactly what that figure is until closer to the end of June. So we should have something to help in this process. We're just not sure yet where we're going to end up. And then if we don't have enough one-time cash, if we don't get enough in state aid, we could hit contingency reserve to make up a bit of the balance. That is another option that we can explore. The cautionary tale, again, in using year-end cash or contingency reserve is that you do create that budgetary imbalance in the following year. So we just have to keep that in mind as we continue to refine and go through this budget process, kind of waiting on Topeka to provide us that formula, is be very aware that if we use one-time money, we're going to have to make that up somewhere in the budget process down the road. Certainly taking out of contingency reserve in and of itself is a risk. At 6 operating days, hitting into that balance, just as we've had a great experience, which will lead us to have some year-end cash, you can see the opposite set of circumstances easily happening where we have the worst weather year and fuel prices skyrocket. We'll be looking for a few $1 million out of the budget. And if we don't have the contingency reserve in place, then we'll be forced to look at some sort of mid-year cut. So those are the risks we kind of have to balance, and why this uncertainty in the budget process as far as a funding formula is so difficult, and why we're not able to give great answers at this point, because we just don't have enough information yet. And this graphic is really just a reminder of the bulk of our dollars are spent directly supporting students. 88% of our operating budget does go into the support of students in the form of teachers, nurses, social workers. You can see that 88% is certainly of the vast majority of our spend, and there's just a very little section of non-direct supporting expenses. So we are very efficient with the use of the operating dollars we have, knowing that if we do go in to cut, where we make any sort of impact is going to be in that 88%, and those become, again, more difficult decisions and choices that the board would be forced to look at. So just a reminder of the legislative timeline that we're under. The legislature does return on May 1st. We don't have an idea yet as far as how quickly we would get a formula and how quickly we would get a tax package to fund a formula. We certainly could be looking at multiple versions of what might occur. We might go through a pass where we get a signature, and then it goes to the court, and then it comes back for more work. So we may be through a few gyrations, knowing that we are still on track for a June 30th deadline, that the legislature had to have an adequate financing formula in place. So again, for next steps, keep a close eye. What happens in these first 2 weeks back? We continue to review those shutdown instructions, which we'll be able to present here at a future board meeting, and then start to really look at, as the formula kind of coalesces, how is it weighted? What are those restrictions that will come back into play? And how does that look for us, and where we're going to be able to spend money, and what we'll have some flexibility on and what we won't under the new formula. So that's kind of our next steps, and I'll open it for questions.
Superintendent Allison.
Ms. Willis made a comment earlier, and it may be something we come back and talk in more depth in May, but when we talk about restricted and unrestricted funds, and if you look on operating revenues and you take a look and you see federal aid to the district, so for example, special education, nutrition services, funds you receive for ELL, title funds, all have a narrow, limited latitude on how those dollars can be spent. So when you really look at our predominant revenues, the smaller portion of our budget is at the board's discretion. The larger portion of our budget we receive specifically tied to the reasons we get the dollars. So you can't shift special ed funds. They need to be spent on special ed students, and that's an area where we don't come close to receiving what it costs us in our budget. Hence, transfers. The October is when we get the first of our state reimbursement. So what we've done in the spring and throughout the summer in providing the transportation, the extended school year, and into the beginning of the school year, all has to be covered up through October before we receive state reimbursement. Nutrition services can only be spent on nutrition services. Title IIA funds, when discussion has come around, like the MTSS coaches and facilitators, their requirements we have around professional development and other support. That's how those dollars are allocated. You can't decide we're just not going to meet those requirements and use the funding in some other way. So the large majority of the budget, when you look at our budget in its entirety, are restricted funds, which is what makes it so difficult when the board in developing a budget and you're having to look like last year at $22 million to get the budget to balance for this fiscal year. You're looking at a smaller portion of that total budget in which to make the decisions. Those other areas cannot be put into play in those discussions. And that may be, it's been a while since we've walked through that and looked at some of those specific areas, and that may be worthwhile doing next month.
Yeah, we're pulling some data on that right now, so we should have something by the next board meeting to present on that.
And again, board members, I do not have the queue working, so please signify if you want to say anything. Okay, I do have just one question, and it's a little bit in regards to what Ms. Akins was referring to earlier, where we have money at the end of the year that we can use towards our budget. On the slide where you're talking about operating revenues and operating expenses and the $8.2 million difference between those two for this year, for the 18 budget, that $8.2 million is what we're hoping we have enough money from savings in fuel, savings in utilities, those pieces that, because we've had a mild winter and couldn't hire enough bus drivers and so on, we're hoping we have that amount to cover what we know is going to be a hole this year, correct?
What our ideal hope is besides getting fully funded, the 8.2, is that some combination of year-end cash and new funding would cover the $8.2 million. We probably won't end the year as far as unbudgeted, unplanned cash to cover the full 8.2, but depending on what that number is, we might be able to dip a little bit into contingency until we have a better idea of what might be coming from the state. It'll all be about timing. When will we know what the formula looks like, how much it might be coming our way, but knowing that we will end the year with some sort of cash left, plus the fact that we do have some contingency, we should be able to at least kind of float along until we get a number from the state as far as what they're going to cover, knowing that if we got nothing, that would be the option, is we have to use the year-end cash balance. We might have to dip into contingency reserve.
Because we have to balance a budget.
We have to
have
balance the
no
budget,
option
right.
to pass it off to someone else.
But again, when you're using contingency reserve, you're using any end-of-year cash, whether that's $2 million, $3 million, whatever that looks like, that means this time next year, that 8.2 is automatically where you're starting as a budget hole, and then you add all the other general cost increase on top of that.
Right.
So just like with the steps and tracks last year, utilizing some of the funding from the equity and that decision, as well as some of that end-of-year cash, covered it for this budget year, but that's not covering it for the next budget year. Right. So that's the piece. What we've shifted in capital outlay, and I've mentioned this in previous meetings, almost $12 million from capital to help cover general fund items, so that there was not the need to cut additional at that point in time. At some point in the next several years, budget-wise, that's got to be righted again.
Right.
And that's where I gave the example of HVAC units and those types of things. So, you know, the more you kick down the road, the closer we get to a point in time in the budget that you're going to have significant cuts necessary to be able to balance the budget, because those dollars don't exist.
Right. And if we wanted to add the $3 million to be able to change our calendar, which we've already made the decision on the calendar now, but if we had wanted to do that, that would have taken away from that $8.2 million, and we would have had to cut something else, correct?
Or utilized all of contingency reserve in order to get to the balanced budget.
All of contingency reserve and also jump into our textbook, correct?
Well,
Your number
again-
becomes 11.2.
Right, the
that
number,
you'd have
right,
to
it
have
just
looked at.
increases the 8.2 to 11.2. Again, not knowing exactly where we're going to end up, that we're kind of estimating where we might end. Can't say definitively today how much contingency we would have to get, whether it's 8.2 or 11.2, but knowing that if we end the year with 3, 4, 5 in cash, the difference between 8 and 11, that's how much we'd have to go in
Right.
to either contingency or potentially textbooks or some other cash that we have designated for another purpose. Again, assuming the new formula allows some of that, which is
And
another
there
question
isn't a
we
lot
still
of
have.
places where we can do that other than contingency and textbooks.
Contingency is unbudgeted, so that's fairly open. With the textbook, we have a reading adoption planned. Certainly, taking money out of textbooks potentially impacts that, but, you know, that
And we
would
just
be a
took money
decision.
out of textbooks to buy the new
We
math
just purchased the math
adoption.
adoption, right. Again, we probably have, there's capital outlay expenses that we haven't moved that you could, but again, that just exacerbates the problem we already have in capital outlay where we're not getting to capital projects because we've moved money or
And we're
expenses in there.
currently in capital outlay at 6 days of,
In contingency.
beg your pardon, in contingency at 6 days.
That's correct.
And so anything we take out of there means we have
Fewer days to
fewer
cover.
days that we could, if the state's late paying us or anything else, we aren't able to do anything.
Right. That's
And
correct.
you are at the cap in your mill levy for capital outlay. So there's no additional room to add capital outlay revenue in the future.
Okay, Ms. Akins?
Just a clarification, in that budget discussion you just had about cutting, that assumes that our numbers are the same revenue next year, correct?
That's correct.
So if the legislature actually follows the Supreme Court's finding and doesn't shut schools down, then we will have additional money next year.
That is our ideal option where they at least cover the 8.2 plus potentially
Something.
more.
Something. And then secondly, I just want to point out that in the last 3 years, according to our own year-end finance report that we get every month, in 2014, we had $1.9 million out of purchase services that we saved in our budget by being responsible, and $1.25 million in transportation. In 2015, we had $1.8 million in utilities and 1.7 in transportation and 2.4 million in supplies that we saved by being good budget managers. And in 2016, we had 1.3 million in purchase services, 2.5 million in utilities, and 2.6 million in transportation at the end of the year by being good budget managers. Correct?
Good budget managers and some other
Whether
circumstances going
being
on.
well, not being able, but we
Hire
had,
drivers. We
but we
ended-
did have, by handling the budget and watching it and doing our due diligence,
Right.
we did have some money left at the end of the year to help fold in. That wasn't set for special education or some specific case. It's for transportation that can be rolled over. And in fact, in 2016, we were allowed to roll over 2.8 million from special ed and hold it because the law had changed the way that that was held.
Right. That was the advantage of the block grant, was that under the block grant, any leftover cash, if you will, you could actually add to and spend as new budgetary money. The year before that, it was actually a reduction in your state aid.
Right. So for special education, before, if you had it at the end of the year, too bad, but now, under the new law for last year, we were able to carry that forward to use in our general budget. Has that law changed? We don't know because we don't know what's going to happen.
That's right.
So it's an unknown, right? So I don't want to make bets on things, but it's an unknown. So I just want to make those points of clarification. Worst case scenario is flat, but if we're flat, then we probably aren't opening our doors because the Supreme Court's taken a pretty serious stance on this thing. So I just want to make that point clear.
Betty? Oh, okay. All right, I'm seeing no other comments. Thank you very much. We appreciate Budget 101. We need this. Thank you.